Thank you, fellow Toastmasters. I have a partner in a business, and we give financial advice. And part of our job is we develop plans for individuals. And part of that process is developing projections. And my business partner, we always warn our clients that the projections we use to look for direction and danger points. And my business partner always uses the line, he goes, because the danger is, he says, if you look out to 2050 here, the computer shows you owning Canada. And that is the danger of projections. You take what is a direction you're heading in now, and you basically multiply that by the number of years, and it gets you to this tremendous number, enough to own Canada in the case of someone who's making a high income in this particular year. And what struck me about the earlier presentation was that a lot of these presentations were for 2050, 2010 to 2050, and when you're looking for policies that affect a long period of time like that you have to keep in mind those policies are based on assumptions you're making. So is it the assumptions you have to check, first of all? A couple things there that I found interesting. Average number of children per woman. 1.5 around on this page. In developed nations, it's right around just over 1.5. I believe, and I'm fairly certain of this, didn't get a chance to check my statistics, but basically the reproduction rate for women, basically the number of children women have to have just to keep the population same over time, is over 2.1. I'd be willing to hear anyone say otherwise. It makes sense. A woman has a husband, they have to replace themselves, and then you have to replace the women who do not have any children, or the men who do not have any children, if you want to look at it that way. So a bigger factor than the amount of children that these least developed countries, women in, are having, is where they are in this spectrum. Because if you're assuming 80 million children in these least developed countries in 2050, how much of that is based on the idea that they're each having over 4 children in 2050? Is it a more important question where they are? If they're in developed country status, and maybe that's not feasible, but let's just say they are, well then they'd actually be looking for immigrants to just maintain their own population. So a lot of the challenges and questions that were mentioned about having this large population among least developed countries is better answered by answering the question, I think, of how do you go from least developed countries to developed countries? And to give an example of how these things can happen in divergent ways for countries who are starting from the same point. Well, I'm going to start right after World War II, and much of East Asia was, if they used the term then, least developed countries. They were as poor could be, pretty much on level with sub-Saharan Africa, or maybe the African nation continent as an average on whole. If you look at many countries in East Asia now, they are among the wealthiest in the world. Japan, obviously, but Korea as well, it's a large nation. Singapore. Sub-Saharan Africa, adjusted for inflation, is maybe at the level they were post-World War II. They've essentially gone nowhere. So I'm certain, in Japan is most certainly the example, Japan now, about 40, more like 50 years after World War II, only has about 1.2 children for the women. In sub-Saharan Africa, I'm sure that the average is over 4, as you saw in the statistic. So the question is, more to me, is developing some of these policies is what do these countries do to end up more like Japan and Korea than to end up where many sub-Saharan African countries did for the last 50 years. And in my opinion, and I know I'm opinionated in this regard, it has to do with liberty, with economic liberty, and personal liberties. And in personal liberties, I would include property rights, which are basically not respected in many countries in this world, where if you produce something, somebody in power can come along and take it. Or there's a feeling that whatever you produce is owned more by the society or reality, the government in control. And I think that's even borne out in some of the previous speakers' examples. Invest in human capital, including youth, strengthen employability. The exact example he used is Northern Africa. Now, across Northern Africa, there's actually a high level of education. And I don't know how many people remember this, but the whole Arab Spring started, and I can't pronounce the man's name, but it's a Tunisian fruit merchant. Tunisian fruit merchant who immolated himself, set himself afire because the authorities in Tunisia kept basically confiscating his fruit stand or making it impossible for him to make a living. Kind of proves the point about personal property. But the other point about it is he's actually a college graduate, or maybe a technical college the way we look at it, but he had computer skills and no ability to utilize those skills. So he had human capital in this country, in many other countries, in this country. I don't think he would have been selling fruit. I think he would have been able to utilize those skills to a greater degree. And I think that it's more important when we're looking at these policies over an extended period of time that we look at what are the public policies, which are often economic policies, that allowed those East Asian countries to move to greater wealth, and many of the African countries do not. And I think if you do that, if you allow greater economic growth and look to, as an international community, look to encourage that in countries such as this, demographic problems actually take care of themselves. And in fact, you can end up in the opposite scenario where you're like Japan and a lot of Europe, where you're looking for people to come just to maintain population. So in conclusion, I would say promises, challenge, and implications of demographic change. I think if these countries instituted the right policies, the demographic change they see would be tremendous as they became more similar to developing countries, and many of the problems mentioned here then disappear by themselves. Thank you.